Greetings, students! Welcome to Office Hours, the program where I, Professor Bulwer Smythe, answer your questions about the peculiarities of this world. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Frank of the Quite Frankly podcast for covering our show on his. We got many new subscribers in the wake of his shouting us out, and to them I would like to say, hello and welcome. If you would like your question answered on the show, please drop us a line in the comments below. Now, let's dive in. Patreon subscriber Dayman Woe asks, my friend has a random question. She is wondering what the mathematical equations are on the chalkboard in the background. Thank you for your question, Dayman. It is always a pleasure. It took me just a moment to piece together to what your friend was referring, and then I realized... You're talking about my tapestry! It is not in fact a chalkboard, though I can see how you would think that. It is a piece of art that I commissioned from a diagram that I rather like. The diagram was mentioned in the book Starry Speculative Corpse by Eugene Thacker. It is actually, now that you bring it up, not a completely irrelevant book to this channel. We have many times here received variations on the question of why is the Illuminati insisting that the Earth is a round globe instead of a flat map-like shape? This series, including also the books In the Dust of This Planet and Tentacles Longer Than the Night, examines the philosophical implications of such trends as the displacement of the center of the universe away from the Earth. In any case, I can't say that I wholeheartedly endorse this book. Its larger conclusions did not quite cohere for me. However, it is useful as a sort of zoo of grotesqueries, a menagerie, if you will, and it presents an interesting commentary on a number of historical figures who I likely would not otherwise have come into contact with. And I do sincerely like his commentary on this diagram. He plots it out of a 17th century publication entitled The Metaphysical, Physical, and Technical History of the Two Worlds, the Major as well as the Minor, by Robert Flood. Flood's treatise is, as you may have surmised from the title, quite far-ranging. Complementing the scope of his subject, Flood's mind is extremely technical in a way that led him to embellish his writings with complex technical diagrams and dense tables throughout. His complicating mind, though, was baffled when he reached the subject of what existed before this universe. Unwilling to deny his illustrative impulse, though, he produced this diagram. Almost absurd in its simplicity, it is a black square with cursive Latin adorning every side reading Et sic infinitum, which translates to thus eternally. This is compelling to me for a number of reasons. There is a tension between the structure of the form of the diagram and the boundlessness indicated by it. It seems to me that a circle with the inscription curled around it might appeal more to a more modern sensibility, awash as we are with notions of black holes, big bangs, and atomic nuclei. But then the circle was not unknown to early modern man, and indeed even figures into the mystical tradition of which Flood was a disciple in terms of emanations and spheres of the planets and so on and so forth. The square implies to me that, in Flood's view, though the pre- or un-universe was a boundless black, there is still some pre-existing directional structure. There may be no orientation because there are no reference points, but there is still somehow a north, east, south, and west, a technical orient, occident, and so forth. This we cited earlier in the course as our aesthetic judgment on why we chose to accept the universe as a donut theory, and why we haven't outright rejected the flat earth theory. The metaphysical undergirding of the four directions is simply too appealing. On an artistic level, this diagram is also appealing as an expression of frustration at that which refuses to be interrogated. The quadruplicity of the Latin instruction is repetitive in a way that feels desperate. It is as though Flood says, 0 is unacceptable. The lowest I will go is 4. I I just love it. Matt D asks, be straight with me. Put it on the level. Nice right angles, perfectly square. What could it mean? Well done, Matt. I did want to respond to this comment because it occurred to me as I read these amassed cliches the extent to which truth is figured in terms of the square, which is strangely pertinent to the topic we just discussed. The upright square is, of course, very significant in architecture, engineering, dancing, and the other gravitational arts, as perpendicularity is the cornerstone of the stability of an object at rest, and is a natural standard for stackables. However, I do think that, for our purposes, as your lampooning comment is appropriately indicated, such metaphors are not entirely appropriate. Our truth is not, metaphorically speaking, an object at rest. The dynamism of inquiry is more alike to the panicked counterbalancing of a circus plate spinner, or the whirling of a dervish. This, I think, is a better model for truth, for living, breathing, thinking individuals. Leave the right angles for architecture. We will keep our acuteness and our obtusities for ourselves. Ah, yes. For our next question, I have not an answer, per se, but some extra credit to assign you. Gary Americano notes in response to our video on Prince Wilhelm von Meister, his grandmother, Lila Trapman, wrote and illustrated a very strange-looking book, The Spoofah and the Antidote, in 1898. I have been able to find the cover of this book online, and it is outrageously intriguing. However, it is exceedingly rare and expensive. WorldCat.org lists this book as being held in 6 libraries around the world. And if any of you, my viewers, have memberships at these libraries, I implore you to check this book out. Take photos or scans of it and email them to me, your professor. The libraries are the New York Public Library System, the Princeton University Library, Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia, the National Library of Scotland, the British Library, and the University of Cambridge's library. That book, once again, is The Spoofah and the Antidote, written by Lila Trapman. Thank you, Gary, for finding this book. It is a very stimulating lead. Moving on. Patreon subscriber RoboDad asks about the Philadelphia Art Museum. He noticed the layout looked like the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, and that the whole building is set up like a temple on the Acropolis, with a statue of Diana giving pride of place in the lobby, and with the whole complex resembling the Eye of Ra, perhaps perceiving a star or being the tip of a wand. He further notes that the designer, Horace Trumbauer, was a Freemason. It is synchronistic that you have asked about this, because I've just been considering the role of museums more generally. What, in fact, are these institutions? Gatherers and purveyors of artifacts and art, yes, but to what end? The art world would have you believe that these are merely an end to themselves, an argument that I believe is convincing to the artists and perhaps even to some of the patrons, but which I sincerely doubt is a moving factor for the moneyed interests behind these institutions, whose patronage established the very concept of patronage. We have clear evidence that modern art has been used by the CIA as propaganda, likely without the knowledge of the artists themselves. Unwitting use is the general rule, too, in the achievement of illuminated plans. Art is likewise used by cartels and white-collar criminals in order to effect money laundering, due to the high and highly variable value of artworks and the ease of transporting and storing them. There is another interest that I think has a stake here as well. The second wholly public museum ever opened was known as the Ashmolean Museum. It opened in 1683 and is named after Elias Ashmole, the 17th century Englishman who is responsible for its establishment. Ashmole is, in addition to being a historian and a lawyer, a student of the occult sciences, alchemy and astrology. His most significant publication in this field remains significant today among those circles, the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum. What I find interesting about this publication, especially regarding his role in the early foundations of museums, is that it is not an original text, but a collection of manuscripts that he curated. This is, of course, the foundational method of putting together a museum. Another noteworthy entry in Ashmole's occult career is that his notebooks contain the first mention of Freemasonry ever in England, a fraternity that he himself was a member of. When we consider the conviction of Freemasonry that the planning of public spaces can produce occult effects in the context of a personality that has demonstrated success in curating and arranging occult texts, it suggests an efficacy of the museum in channeling powerful forces in the cultural consciousness, an efficacy co-opted by those most brutish middlemen of the Illuminati, the CIA, and the cartels. But pieces of art are not alchemical texts, and the Ashmolean Museum is not the Theatrum Chemicum Britannicum. Or is it? I am reminded of something that we have spoken about on this channel before, that I refer to as Cthulhu's dreams. In H.P. Lovecraft's text, The Call of Cthulhu, he describes the dreams of sensitive people around the world being disrupted by the shifting nightmares of an ancient power that lies dreaming under the sea. In that story, these awful dreams find their way into waking life through the diverse media of art and sculpture. We are led inevitably to the implication that they are signaled, too, by the story that we are reading. I've always wondered if that weren't a truly self-birthing concept. From out the parallel mirrors of its self-reference, an ugly idea emerges, an art piece that has renegotiated who its parent truly is. Not psychology, but a spiritual authority, leaping through a psychological prism, a sort of dark muse, a Grecian muse, a real spirit that reaches through. A museum, it would seem, is the place to study such things, to collect such things and observe their shifts. I think that this is all especially pertinent to your query, RoboDad, regarding the Philadelphia Art Museum. Before diving too deeply into the specifics around the building, I wanted to comment a bit on the question. It appears that while Horace Trembauer did own the firm that designed the building, Horace was not, in fact, its designer. The architects seem to have been Julian Abel, the first black graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Department of Architecture, and Howell Lewis Shea, who was responsible for the building's plan and massing. I cannot find any reference to Shea being a Freemason, but Abel is another story. Abel was a direct descendant of the founder of Philadelphia's Prince Hall Grand Lodge, and the company he kept makes his membership in that society extremely likely. Wikipedia describes his contribution as having, quote, adapted classical Greek temple columns for the design of the museum entrances, and being responsible for the colors of both the building stone and the figures added to one of the pediments. It is unknowable what other influences Abel may have had on the design and placement, particularly as he was frequently denied credit for his contributions because of his race. But it seems reasonable to assume that there was Masonic influence, whether it came from Abel or his compatriots. And so, considering Abel's contributions, we have two definite things to consider. The first is, as you point out, the seeming dedication of the building to Diana. This is achieved by both the exoteric references to making the building appear as a Greek temple, and the centrality of the Diana statue within the massive lobby of the museum. Diana is an interesting choice here. She is the, shall we say, the friendliest face of the three-faced goddess who was the essential patron of witchcraft from antiquity through the Middle Ages, Hecate. Is she meant here to bless a particular operation? We have another reference to Hecate in the tripartite nature of the museum's construction, with its central, western, and eastern buildings. The second element we have to consider here is the pediments. Though 8 pediments were meant to have been adorned, only one of those has actually been completed, and that one is a real stunner. Much as I have looked it up and pondered it, I cannot bring it into alignment with the other peculiarities of this museum. I will point out a few intriguing elements, though, and hopefully you, my students, may be able to take it farther. This is a relief of 14 figures from Greek mythology. They are grouped in 5 themes. The first 3 are the Owl of Athena, goddess of wisdom, Eos, the Titaness opener of the gates of dawn, and Nous, the first thought. These 3 may correspond to the supernal triad at the top of the Kabbalistic tree of life, to which you alluded, Robodad, in your question. The next group, though, are erotic figures. Adonis, who was, to use the contemporary parlance, a famed himbo, Aphrodite and Eros, and a man, Hippomenes, who Aphrodite inflamed in such a way that he had sex in a temple and was then turned into a lion as punishment. Their grouping also suggests the Rider-Waite Strength Tarot card, which uses the woman and lion theme to symbolize the conquest of the passions, the lion, by the person, the woman. However, if we are to take this story and apply that meaning to it, the result is a rather Machiavellian and eroticized sense of strength. In the center, we have Zeus, dividing the 2 sides with his full frontal nude exposure. Next to him, we have Demeter and Triptolemus. The foremost taught the art of agriculture by the latter, and he taught it forward to all of Greece. They seem to represent applied wisdom. And then our final group of 4 figures includes Ariadne, Theseus' erstwhile bride, watching Theseus slay the Minotaur, who is backed up by another monster, the Python. The Minotaur here seems to have a creeping method of locomotion, as though he were one of the snake's kin. It is a thoroughly masculine vision of strength, and the materiality of the muscles and monsters here forms somewhat of a counterpart to the supernal identifications we made on the other end of the sculpture. But this mixture of elevated spirituality, sex, conflict, and science, balanced around Zeus, does not carry a clear message to me. The pieces are there, but it is yet too vague to truly forge a clear story out of. I should be interested to hear what you, my students, think of this. But before we entirely move on, I would like to address your suggestion regarding the macro layout of the grounds. While the layout of the plaza before the museum does not quite look close enough to the Kabbalistic Tree of Life to me to warrant such a read, I cannot say the same for the placement of the museum in the city proper. The museum is the terminus of a long road that runs without regard to the grid streets that it cuts through, whose other end is City Hall. If you will allow me, now, I will give a brief outline of some of the correspondences I've noted in the city planning of this section to the Tree of Life, and the principal purpose that I believe this may have been created to do. The City Hall at the base corresponds to Malkuth, the sphere of worldly things. The first stop along the road from City Hall gives us our Yesod, the plaza with the love statue displayed. This opens up 2 regions on the left and right which correspond to Hode and Netzach, with science museums such as the Academy of Natural Sciences and the Franklin Institute corresponding to Hode on the left, and art museums such as the Barnes Foundation and the Rodin Museum corresponding to Netzach on the right. This brings us to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is a sprawling complex that serves not only emotive artworks, but also a dedication to the depth of crafts in its armor and rug collections. This corresponds to Tifereth, the sphere of beauty. Further along this path, on the left, we have a zoo corresponding to Gdura, which the Wikipedia defines as the essence of judgment and limitation. And on the right, invoking the bounty of Chesed, we have the ancient Lemon Hill Mansion. Finally, in the supernal triad, we have the eastern and western portions of the city's largest green space, Fairmount Park, and what I suppose to be the original intention of this occult project, the Schuylkill River as Ketha, the crown or the source. At the time of constructing this building, the Philadelphia water supply was in deep trouble. Several waterborne illnesses were harming the city because the river had become so polluted by the sewage system. Could it be that the Philadelphia Museum was built in such a spot as an attempt to complete an architectural spell to solve the government's water crisis? Did the city planners purposefully align the mansions of the city's old money in such a spot to receive supplementary benefits? Income disparity and water cleanliness have both increased in the decades since the project's completion. Any insight from Philadelphia-dwelling viewers is encouraged, indeed solicited. But for now, let's move on.
We're rolling, Professor. Oh, a side note.
Yes.
You might want to say Happy Father's Day to Robo-Dad.
Ah, yes, of course, Robo-Dad. Happy Father's Day to you, my friend. I hope that your robot children or fleshly children are hale and hearty. And you yourself these days as well.
I imagine that he's a robot and that his kids are regular flesh kids.
Yes, I imagine that too. I won't put too much imagination into the mechanism by which that might come to be, but I find it to be a very vision of bliss.
Great, so moving on.
Moving on. Moving on. Patreon subscriber Samuel McCandless asks, Professor, would you rather eat bat soup or a Cascade taco? Thank you for your question, McCandless. I am always happy to do a little restaurant role play. I'll have the bat soup, please. Extra spicy. While we wait for our meal, let's address another question. Johnny Boy asks, I have a rabbit hole here. During the Fatima vision, the apparition explains the evils of Russia and how it will spread across the world if we don't follow certain guides. There are a lot of intricacies in the details surrounding Fatima, but to be brief, there is reason to believe the consecration of Russia never occurred as requested. The revealing of the third mystery wasn't revealed in 1960 as requested, and when it was largely rejected as false. There are so many questions surrounding this event, I imagine you could weave a web from it. Thank you for your question, Johnny, and welcome to the channel. The Fatima event is certainly an intriguing one. For those unfamiliar with the event, allow me to recap it here. Over the course of 6 months in 1917, 3 shepherd children in Portugal catalogued 6 apparitions of a woman bright shining as the sun. These began on the 13th of May and culminated on the 13th of October. Over the course of these reports, the children grew famous and began to attract crowds to their fields, who hoped to see the visions for themselves. The apparition told them that on the 13th of October, it would demonstrate a miracle for all to see and believe. And so it did. A crowd estimated to be between 30,000 and 100,000 saw a wide variety of visions. The general consensus seems to be that after a rainstorm, the sun careened toward the earth and then zigzagged back to its normal position, miraculously drying the people on the ground after doing so. On October 13th, 1930, 13 years after the events, the Catholic Church declared the experience to be, quote-unquote, worthy of belief. The apparition made a number of proclamations and requests, which were not revealed until years later, when Lucia, the surviving witness, published them. 2 of the 3 children died, according to both prophecy and history, within 2 years of the events, and the 3rd lived to the ripe old age of 97. The children who died were beatified in 2000 and canonized in 2017, 100 years after the events. While your question centered on the larger geopolitical questions at the end of this saga, what caught my eye mostly were the certain peculiar events around the beginning of it. The prevalence of the number 13 is quite strange for a supposedly Christian apparition. At least 4 of the 6 sightings, the ones in May, June, September, and October, occurred on the 13th, and these include the beginning and end of the saga. Moreover, the children were apprehended on the 13th of August, which perhaps delayed a sighting that would have otherwise been scheduled for that date. Moreover, the church concluded their investigation after 13 years and declared the events worthy of belief on the 13th of October as well. Then there is the strangeness surrounding the request for sacrifices by the entity. There is an episode related in the collected writings of Lucia, Fatima in Lucia's own words. In it, the children are asked, "Did the apparition instruct you to pray for sinners?" To which one of the children replies in the negative. In a later private conference, Lucia asked her compatriot why they had lied, and the child replied with a legal-minded answer that they were not asked to pray for sinners, but to sacrifice for them. The sacrifices are demonstrated as secretive and strange elsewhere in the text as well. Consider this exchange, where one child asks another, "Why can't we say that the lady told us to make sacrifices for sinners?" And the reply, "So they won't be asking what kind of sacrifices we're making." This is out of joint with the reports elsewhere in the text that the sacrifices they make are to share their lunches with other children, or to patiently accept hardships. These sacrifices are fully condoned by church and priest alike. What sacrifices were they that the children insisted on hiding? Consider also the infernal visions granted by the lady to the children. The little shepherds were subjected on one of their visitations to this picture of hell. I quote, "Our Lady showed us a great sea of fire which seemed to be under the earth. Plunged in this fire were demons and souls in human form, like transparent burning embers, all blackened or burnished bronze, floating about in the conflagration, now raised in the air by flames that issued from within themselves together with great clouds of smoke, now falling back on every side like sparks in a huge fire, without weight or equilibrium, and amid shrieks and groans of pain and despair, which horrified us and made us tremble with fear. The demons could be distinguished by the terrifying and repellent likeness to frightful and unknown animals, all black and transparent." Nor was this the only such visitation. Elsewhere is described this encounter by Jacinto, the boy witness, who was in a state of distress. Quote, "What's wrong? What happened to you?" In a voice half smothered with fright, he replied, "It was one of those huge beasts that we saw in hell. He was right here, breathing out flames." It is not the typical way of Mary to be accompanied by demons, nor is 13 generally considered to be her number. Could it be that this was not, in fact, Mary, but was some other entity claiming to be Mary? We have an interesting candidate for the role, a Lusitanian goddess named Trebaruna. Fatima exists in a place in Portugal that, prior to Roman colonization, was referred to as Lusitania. The nation had its own long-standing religious traditions before being conquered, and many of their gods were appropriated by the Romans after conquering. Trebaruna is a bit of a mysterious figure, but it seems that she was a sun goddess and was also associated with the hearth and with waters. This is interesting because Our Lady of Fatima's most dazzling miracle is referred to as a miracle of the sun, and involved the strange motion of that celestial body directly after a rain bringing in the water element. There are a few other interesting corroborations as well. Other scholars have already observed that certain other Portuguese processions in honor of the Virgin Mary seem to have descended from sun goddess worship, particularly in her form as Senhora de Antim. I also find it interesting that the vision of hell which she grants to the children should so resemble the crackling of a fire, the sort of scene framed in a hearth. Furthermore, Trebaruna was syncretized by the Romans with Victoria, a martial god of victory. One of the key ideas conveyed by the Marian apparition was that the children should pray the rosary to end the First World War, and the substance of her second secret was a threat that if Russia were not consecrated to her Immaculate Heart, an awful war should break out. The meddling of Mary, the Mother of Christ, in these world wars seems uncharacteristic and misplaced. The interest of Victoria, the goddess of conquest, however... The last point I would like to bring up are that the inscriptions to Trebaruna indicate that her characteristic sacrifice was sheep. The fact that she appeared to 3 shepherd children and requested of them a sacrifice, which the children were later cagey in revealing the details of, suggests that it was not suffering that she sought, but the sheep that were the children's charge.
That was brilliant, Professor. Your performance of the whole apparition and the things that kids
Oh,
said.
yes, the dramatic reading, yes.
I loved the dramatic reading.
Thank you very
That
much.
was so impressive.
I've been attending one of my colleagues' lectures, and well, thank you very much.
Have you been doing a drama class?
Yes, I'm going to a drama class a little bit on the...
I'm so impressed. You're a natural professor.
Oh, stop it.
No, I'm serious. I've been taking acting too here at Miskatonic, and no, I'm not at that level of oration that you just did now. I'm so impressed. You can't even.
Go on. Well, thank you, Sheila. A kind word is always appreciated. Well, I think that is it for this evening, my students. Let us wrap this up. Thank you so much for your questions and for your attention over the course of this lecture. I look forward to receiving even more questions from you soon. If you like this show and would like to support our research, consider joining the Patreon. There you'll receive early access to the videos, special thanks at the end, annotated bibliographies for all of the shows, and occasional extra goodies as well. And you will also receive my most sincere thanks. Until next time, may you bask in the sun of wisdom, just as do our reptile overlords.